Capital Record, where we defend free enterprise and capital markets because we believe in the dignity of the human person. Well, hello and welcome to another episode of David Bahnsen's Capital Record, brought to you by National Review. It is so tempting to want to just break out into a discussion of all the things happening in the world right now that are relevant to economics. The developments in the discussions with US and China, the president's announcement about price fixing attempts in the Medicare pharmaceutical space, that's definitely going to warrant its own Capital Record probably this week. The evolution of what's happening with the tax bill. And then there's other geopolitical things as well that may not seem as directly relevant to Capital Record. The best thing I can say, though, is that's really what my sister podcast, I just made that term up right now, but the Dividend Cafe is the podcast I do through the Bahnsen Group, the private wealth management company that I founded and run, where it's much more investment oriented, markets oriented, financial market discussion is really more appropriate at Dividend Cafe. So for those topics, it's a good chance for me to cross plug the other podcast. Capital Record is really where I want to be more philosophical and ideological, and Dividend Cafe is much more actionable and investment markets oriented. And some of those things I just mentioned require a Capital Record response. For example, the utterly socialistic nature of attempts at price fixing in the pharmaceutical space, for example. But in terms of the market reaction to what is going on and where we see things headed and the projections around the US-China trade deals, that's a little outside the lane that I've sort of created for Capital Record and more in the very specific lane that Dividend Cafe exists for. So if you are not getting Dividend Cafe and you're a Capital Record listener and you think you can handle more of my voice in your feed, then I would heartily recommend Dividend Cafe for all things markets related. I assure you, I take the same first principles approach at Dividend Cafe as I do in Capital Record, but just the focus and objective and the emphasis of what we're doing there is a little different. Today is actually a Capital Record episode I've been excited to do. And at one point, I even teed it up that I was going to do it for last Thursday's episode. And then we ended up having a sort of topical intervention that forced me to do a different deal. But I want to bring up today the issue of conservative economics and libertarian economics. And my old friend Jonah Goldberg, is still my friend, but he was my friend in years gone past, and so hence the expression old friend, had done a podcast recently himself where he had referred to the idea that conservative and libertarian economics were always sort of thought of as the same thing. And in a moment, I'm going to explain why he's exactly right about that, what he's getting at and where that overlap exists. But what he's doing is sort of bemoaning the idea that conservatives now, as he's calling them, or people on the right, have leaned more into a populist economics and are pitting that against a more libertarian mindset. And I think the vocabulary here is important, and I don't think a lot of this needs to just be reduced to, oh no, the only distinction here is semantics. I think there are some semantical things we could get into, but I also just accept the basic premise that there has always been an accepted overlap, and if not mere Venn diagram overlap, kind of understanding of where the conservative approach, libertarian approach, we're generally referring to something similar. And I think that what many are bemoaning is, well, the populist approach is very different. It doesn't, is the populist approach the new conservative economics? And that itself is pitted against libertarian economics, or where have we gone astray here? I want to kind of come in and take a different angle than many take. I don't want to defend the traditional understanding of libertarian economics, even though I basically want to defend where the vast majority of it goes in matters of public policy. I most certainly do not want to defend the notion of populist economics as a credible synonym for conservative economics. I believe they are diametrically opposed for reasons I'll get into shortly. When the new right wants to take on libertarian economics, they will often be honest enough to say, yes, what we're critiquing is free market orthodoxy. So I suppose the question then becomes, who gets the right to the term conservative economics? Those holding on to free market orthodoxies or those holding on to new right populism? What I want to suggest is that to do this right, to fully square this circle, and yes, where I believe the right use of the term conservative economics lies, requires something different than what libertarian economics has done, but it also requires not forfeiting what libertarian economics has done, which is the fatal flaw that so much populism is guilty of. So let me break down what I'm getting at here. Why I think it's a reasonably true thing to say, as Jonah did, that libertarian and conservative economics have always been basically considered almost totally overlapped. Was there sort of shared appeal to Hayekian principles, Friedrich Hayek, the kind of concepts embedded in the knowledge problem, in the merits of a price mechanism, of spontaneous order, and its opposition to central planning. A basic appeal in both conservative and libertarian economics to what we grew up calling laissez-faire economics, the classical economic mantra that the governmental role was to have its hands off the economy and that there was freedom in exchange, freedom in marketplace transactions that led to tremendous economic growth. In other words, free enterprise is sort of the basic common ground of the conservative and libertarian approach. But what if that is the actual problem? That populism has decided this approach is inadequate because in its shared common ground around what it's against, central planning, statism, market interruptions, market distortions, market interventions, that we have sort of deified the market as the end instead of as a means to the end that we have a sort of epistemological responsibility to define. I am very sensitive to the accusation that markets are intended to be the end in and of themselves in conservatism, because I do not agree that that is the case. I believe markets are fundamentally the freedom of individuals to socially cooperate. And I believe that that is itself a value, is a gift, it is a byproduct of created design, and I would defend all of it and add to that defense the instrumentation of market interactions in leading to what is my real end, which is the flourishing of the human person. When we reduce market orthodoxies to basically good enough in and of themselves, as long as they exist, that is our fundamental purpose, I think that we limit the efficacy of our argument, limit the potency of what I consider to be conservative economics. Conservative and libertarian economic policy have common ground in what they don't want in an economic framework: central planning, high regulation, high taxation, aforementioned distortions. And all of that is true and right, whether one is wearing a conservative hat or libertarian hat. Both sides, in that sense, if they aren't one and the same, are philosophically correct. The difference is that when we miss the why of it all, why do we oppose these interventions and distortions? Why do we oppose the regulations, the taxation, the central planning, if it is merely pragmatic, if it is merely econometric, if we believe it is purely a part of a scientific order that will lead to some better result measured in all sorts of dubious ways, as opposed to the qualitative improvement in standard of living for human beings, then I think we have a problem. But even this fails to really capture what I want to get to, which is where I believe Austrian economics, which of course was sort of a philosophical bedrock to what we're for shorthand calling libertarian economics, with Karl Menger in the late 19th century and Ludwig von Mises into the 20th century, they really did lay the framework for the accurate idea that economics is the study of human action, that humans allocating scarce resources is our focus in economics, and that Mises referred to this term of praxeology, that there's a logic of human action that needs to be our focus, that trumps things like a Keynesian central planning, a obsession with math and science, which is all math and data, which is always pretextual to getting experts to centrally plan an economy. And the Austrian argument was that embedded in human action was the logic and the reasoning that would drive a better result. And Hayek did so much development of this throughout the 20th century. And it, again, to the old point, whether one is branding themselves libertarian or conservative, all of this is basically embedded in a lot of what one would consider to be a conservative economic framework. I'm merely arguing that it is all necessary, but not sufficient. And my libertarian friends would say it most certainly is sufficient. Regardless of what one does with it from there, that's what we need as the common ground. It's good enough and we should accept it. And it's a kind of foundation for human liberty. But no, I believe that what we have learned, and sometimes learned the hard way in the last 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, is that failure to ask the question why these things are true and to what end is going to prove inadequate. That there is a deep need in conservative economics to go deeper than libertarian economics have needed. What is the philosophical framework that recognizes human action as the foundation of economic study, but doesn't seem interested in understanding the human person, that doesn't seem interested in understanding what the human person was made for? What conservative economics is going to capture the hearts and minds of men? And to use the expression that Hayek talked about, our imagination, this moral adventure. It is an intellectual journey, but it is a moral journey as well, to properly analyze economic activity, calculation, and ultimately have opinions on matters of policy. And that journey requires something deeper than what I believe the libertarian limitation on markets has been willing to do. We must go deeper into a study of the human person and knowing what the human person is made for, so that when we say, no, we are defending free market orthodoxies against populist whims, against the populism of a left or right person, that we can say we are doing so because we have some mooring, some actual depth and grounding to a deeper philosophy that is truly rooted in understanding of the human person and the aims we have for humanity. Do I believe that this is incompatible with libertarian economics? Of course not. What I would suggest, though, is that the full case has to be made, that we have put daylight between libertarian economics and conservative economics because we have been unwilling to see this all the way through. What I am suggesting is that the conservative economics, defined the way I'm defining it herein, does not do what populist economics has done by abandoning quote unquote free market orthodoxy. It holds on to free market orthodoxy, which makes conservative economics contra populism, but it holds on to free market orthodoxies for a deeper purpose than perhaps a libertarian approach is going to do. And that deeper purpose is drive the ultimate intent of humanity. And I cannot define the intent of humanity apart from theology, apart from a distinct philosophy of the human person. If one's philosophy is merely atomistic, which, by the way, many libertarians would say it is, Randian, if it is merely naturalist, if it limits mankind to be essentially a biological robot that is not in the realm of a created being with a purpose, then I believe you will go to a place that will allow populism. And when you go to a place that allows right-wing populism, you will end up in a place that allows left-wing populism, ultimately statism. The idea that what the people want is the bedrock of proper economic philosophy, that our policy ought to be geared towards giving the most popular views their kind of elevated place in the public square, goes against the very conservative notion of limiting principles, of constitutional limits, of rule of law. There is a really important thing to defend contra populism, but to defend it, we must hold on to why we are defending market orthodoxies to begin with. And I think this is just sort of the final sentence that probably could have replaced the entire, I don't know, what are we at, almost 20 minutes of podcast. The bottom line is, I think many people who would identify as libertarian or conservative have made cogent arguments of economic theory and very legitimate cases for proper economic practice. But in any attempt to do so that fails to answer the question, why and to what aim, you're going to end up with an inadequate calculus. We must ask the question, why and to what aim, along with the issues that delve into the logic of human action. This deeper level of human understanding does put daylight between conservative economics, which is the economic philosophy of free enterprise that promotes a free and virtuous society, versus a merely libertarian economics that often gets policy right, that often has some of the great giants shoulders to stand on in Hayek, von Mises, etc., but doesn't fully go where we need to go to win the argument and ultimately promote the society we believe in towards the aim of human flourishing. Thank you very much for listening to David Bahnsen's Capital Record. Look forward to coming back with you very shortly, very likely this week, with another episode that I strongly suspect at this point is going to have to be on price fixing in pharmaceuticals. Thank you, Mr. President. Enjoyed this episode. Please reach out with feedback anytime. And thank you for listening to David Bahnsen's Capital Record.